Okay, thank you, Jane. Thank you all for coming. My name is Moses Otonu. I teach in the history department here. And it's my distinct honor and pleasure to be sitting sandwiched between these two Africanist heavyweights. Mamadou Diouf was my advisor at the University of Michigan, so it's particularly intimidating to have him here, to have to moderate a conversation in which he's involved. And Toyin Falola is a mentor of mine for so many years. But what I'd like to do now is just I'll introduce each of them. And I have a list of questions that were debated back and forth. And so we hope that we have a few quick questions that will stimulate interesting discussions. And I'll read some of them because I'm just afraid that if I wouldn't be able to do justice to them if I didn't read them. The ones that I can read, I'll read them. The ones that I can't read, I'll just paraphrase them. But I'll try to be as faithful as possible to the questions. But let me just introduce our two distinguished guests before we begin. I'll begin with Mamadou Diouf. Again, I'd like to read this stuff because I don't want to leave anything out. He has quite a resume here, so I'd like to be as faithful as possible to it. Mamadou Diouf is the Leitner Family Professor of African Studies and African History at Columbia University. He teaches African history in the departments of Middle East, South Asian and African Studies and History. He is also the director of Columbia University's Institute for African Studies. Diouf holds a PhD from the University of Paris, Sorbonne. For those of you who know the French educational system, it's very elite. Before joining the faculty at Columbia University, he was the Charles D. Moody Jr. Collegiate Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He was also the Director of Research, Information and Documentation Department of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA. It's the premier intellectual and academic body in Africa. It's very prestigious. But also he was a faculty member of the history department at the Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal. His research interests include urban, political, social, and intellectual history in colonial and post-colonial Africa. He is the author and editor of numerous books and articles, including one of the books that you found outside there, his latest work with our own Ifoma Nwankwo, co-edited with her, Rhythms of the Afro-Atlantic, Rituals and Remembrances. He's also author of New Perspective on Islam in Senegal, Conversion, Migration, Wealth, Power, and Femininity, which was published in 2009. He has so many other titles to his name, most of them in French, and I'm not literate in French, so I wouldn't even try to read them. But he's a member of the editorial board of several professional journals, including African Studies Review, Journal of African History, Public Culture, and so on and so forth. He's also the co-editor with Peter Gacher of a very prominent and prestigious book series, Histories of the South, which is published by Catala in Paris, France. He's finally a member of the board of the SSRC. Now, turning to Professor Falola to my right, he is a fellow of the Nigerian Academy of Letters, a fellow of the Historical Society of Nigeria. He's also a distinguished teaching professor and the Frances Higginbotham, now Centennial Professor in History at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of numerous books, including Violence in Nigeria, The Crisis of Religious Politics and Secular Ideologies, and Nationalism and African Intellectuals, which I use in one of my seminars, by the way. He is the co-editor of the Journal of African Economic History, the series editor of Rochester Studies in African History and Diaspora, series editor of the Culture and Customs of Africa, which is published by Greenwood Press, and the series editor of Classic Authors and Texts on Africa, which is published by the Africa World Press. He has received various awards and honors, including the Jean Holloway Award for Teaching Excellence, the Texas Exes Teaching Award, the Chancellor's Council Outstanding Teaching Award, the Cecil B. Corey Award for his book, Economic Reforms and Modernization in Nigeria, and so many other awards. The list goes on and on. For his distinguished contribution to the study of Africa, his students and colleagues have presented him with a set of 3 fetch scripts, 2 edited by Professor Adebayo Oyebade, who promised to join us. I don't know if he's here, but 2 of them edited by him, and another one edited by Akim Ogundiran, titled Pre-Colonial Nigeria, Essays in Honor of Toyin Falola. A recent book on him, a recent biography written by one of his former students, Toyin Falola, The Man, Mask, and Muse, presents a biocritical study of him and his work in about 1,000 pages. His memoir, A Mouth Sweeter Than Water, A Mouth Sweeter Than Salt, I'm sorry, not sweeter than water, sweeter than salt, captures his childhood and received various awards. Finally, he has an honorary doctorate from Monmouth University. Quite an intimidating resume for both of our guests. Okay, let me get this conversation started. And the first question is a very lengthy one because it touches on your personal biographies, but also your intellectual output. And I'm going to start, this question actually I'm going to direct to both of you, but I'll start with you, Professor Diouf. Your respective biographies, both of you, are insightful on many levels. Not only do they illustrate the richness of your intellectual engagements, I think they also reveal the different approaches to colonization adopted by the French and the British, and how this colonization process produced 2 different trajectories. One in relation to maybe the Yoruba people or Nigerians generally, the other in relation to the 4 communes, which relates to your work, Professor Diouf, in modern-day Senegal. In your work, for instance, you argue that the 4 communes had a special status within the French colonial system. You argue, for instance, that they were, I'm quoting you now directly, they were not French culturally, but they were French politically and economically. In other words, they resisted the culture of assimilation, but they appropriated the language of citizenship and republicanism to secure political claims. On the other hand, in Nigeria, colonization was an indirect process without an accompanying project of cultural assimilation or imperial citizenship. Here lies the 2 lines. The lines between the colonizer and the colonial subject was more clearly drawn in Nigeria. The line was sharper, and the imperial community was more discernibly, I would argue, demarcated. Starting from this premise, we want to know how do your 2 different backgrounds tell us something about the diversity of epistemology and of political imaginations in Africa, starting from this broad biographical sketch. I ask this question particularly in the light of the contrasting projects of the French and the British. And in answering this question, if you could just give us a sense of how different the 2 colonial trajectories were with the French and the British.
Thank you, Moses. Let me thank the colleagues and institutions who put together this event and enabled us, Toyin and I, to have a discussion contrasting both our experience, him as a Nigerian, I as a Senegalese, but also as 2 African historians who moved from Africa to land in the US, which created the kind of situation in which both our identity as African, but also our practice as historian have been influenced. I would like in particular to mention Jared and Moses, 3 of whom we had been engaged in an early discussion. To answer directly Moses' question, I would like to refer to my own biography to give a sense of why I was interested by history and how such an interest translated not only into a profession, but into also trying to understand a trajectory. I was born in a small city. If you imagine a map of Africa, you will see the westernmost point of Africa in the Atlantic. It's just the other side of New York. I was born there. And I was born with a French citizenship. I became a Senegalese. And this is something which is interesting to keep in mind. The second element, which is also an important element, is I was born in a city. I don't have a sense of what is a village. And when I was a kid, and you know, when I became a student, I was always amazed by the fact that I was not considered as a true African. And what it meant to be a true African. For somebody who was born in an imperial space, I call these spaces Atlantic enclaves. Because the other aspect, which is an important aspect in our discussion, is that the discussion about the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, the Protestant Atlantic, or the Black Atlantics, are assuming that Africa has to be excluded to discuss the Atlantic. African American studies is born considering the Middle Passage as a rupture. But if you go deep into the history of the Atlantic enclaves, and when I talk the Atlantic enclaves are enclaves from Saint Louis, which was founded by the French, to Luanda, which was founded by the Portuguese. These enclaves have been part of what I call Atlantic networks. They are neither European nor African. They are the product of the encounter. Charles Boxer has a wonderful sentence talking about them. He said that the inhabitants of the enclaves are the product of fighting, cooperating, and fornicating. So, and these people have been part of a process which is a process of mixing, what we call today creolization. And they already announce the world which is the world of the African American, using African American in a much broader sense than US African American. And this is the important aspect. If we bring back these enclaves, what do we get? Which type of Africa do we get? And of course, this discussion has an impact on what Gilroy defined as the Black Atlantic. He said, and this is, I quote, the Black, Africa is a residual presence in the Black Atlantic. I'm saying that the Black Atlantic is a product of processes which are initiated in Africa. And if we don't understand that, we miss actually this whole discussion about the identity of the Atlantic. So I have been trying to trace that in order to understand not only the production of these Creole cultures, Creole being not attached actually to race or skin color, but also how people in particular in these enclaves I'm interested in, which are the enclaves of Senegambia, have been able to use different resources, European, African, but also in this case, Muslim, resources to define an identity of their own in a space which is a space of assimilation, the French policy of assimilation, which define one human species is supposedly colorblind, but is imposing assimilation for integration. And to just give you an example, the first city in which this process unfolded, Saint Louis, the people became actually French citizens in the context of the French Revolution, and were able actually to negotiate an identity of their own by appropriating the value of French republicanism, but also by appropriating the language of liberal democracy to push for their own values within the colonial space. And to resist assimilation, they kept two important elements in Islam, which are quite interesting. One is they were literate Muslim. They were able to read and write Arabic. And they defined their Islam against the Islam of the Arabs. It's a kind of colonial Islam, which is quite interesting, which is a contradiction, but it worked there. And the second thing, in particular among the elite, they remained polygamist, because polygamy was the anti-French value. And they wanted to show that they were. It's why, again, today, when you read today the French discussion about French identity and the debate about the status of black French, polygamy is always there. They are primitive because they are polygamists. These people were saying, we are French, we are polygamists, we are Muslim. So they tried to keep, and they succeeded in that, an identity which is not only different, but which I call an imperial identity, because of the way they navigate back and forth. And they develop, which is also true in a context which is the context of Luanda under the Portuguese. They try always to navigate between these two poles. And their identity is precisely produced by such a navigation. This is an unstable identity. And it made them imperial citizens. They know what is an empire. These people don't know what is a nation. And they will be the victim of nationalism in many of the cases. And they developed this culture of petition. Petitioning was extraordinarily important in their navigation. And in the French case, the interesting aspect is that these originaires, as they call them, but you have the same term in Luanda, where they call themselves old families. They produce a collective memory of their own. And through this production, they were able to create themselves as key actors. And one of the, again, one interesting twist is that in many cases where the whites were trying to abolish slavery, they fought to maintain slavery because this was the economy in which they were accumulating. So you have this very interesting contradiction of blacks or half-blacks fighting to maintain slavery. But my interest in looking at them is precisely in trying to understand how plurality and pluralism is maintained in these enclaves and used by these people, which is very contradictory with what happened what happened after independence. I am also interested in looking at them to contrast it. Toyin will talk better than me about that. Contrast it with indirect rule, because it traced a very long trajectory for these people. I already said that they were imperial citizens. They didn't know what nationalism was about, and they missed it in the 60s. But the other interesting aspect also is that when you look at the way in which, in particular, their form of Pan-Africanism was actually produced, it's a form of Pan-Africanism which is cultural. Is why, in the classical literature, you have always this contrast between negritude, which is cultural nationalism, not very political. Francophones are, it seems, they are more Europe westernized than Anglophone, compared to the Anglophone. But the explanation is simple. In the case of the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, and the Belgian, the idea is the African has to abandon his culture to be granted political and civil rights, okay? So the problem of political right has presented itself in a context of indirect rule is different. Because indirect rule is assuming that African cannot be governed or administered within the Western context. The only way to govern them is through their own institution and their own chiefs, is what is called indirect rule. So of course, the struggle for power and autonomy in the indirect rule system is a political one. But the struggle for autonomy in the case, in the Latin quote-unquote case, as it is called in the literature, is done through culture, recovering your own culture. And Negritude was that, recovering African culture against its rejection by the universal narrative of Western history. So this is probably the possibilities of making this distinction. But what I would like to emphasize is precisely the idea that what happened in the context of the slave trade, you know, with very changing form because of the different temporalities and rhythm until independence, is the emergence of a way of understanding African identity, new, changing, and different from the way in which African identity is lived, deployed in the interland of Africa.
Okay. Well, thank you for your response, and the idea that the people of the four communes were victims of the nationalist project is a very intriguing one, and one that I'm sure will come up in the Q&A. Just like to say shortly that we'll have time at the end. We'll try to create time at the end for you to join in the conversation. So there'll be Q&A time. But just wanted to give Professor Falola also, an opportunity to respond to the same question, to talk about the British indirect rule trajectory and the British imperial system in Nigeria or in Anglophone Africa generally, and how that shaped consciousness and epistemology and political imaginations in colonial times, but also in the post-colonial period, and how that contrasts with the French tradition in Senegal and the French commune, and the four communes especially.
Does this work?
Yeah, it's fine, but it's for the recording.
Or it's just for your own recording? Because I don't project. So please, if you don't hear me at the back, let me know. Well, let me join my friend and colleague in thanking our host, and Professor Landers has always been very gracious, and she's been very kind to me on various occasions. I will add just 5 points to what he has said, so that we can expand and broaden this discussion. And in expanding it, I will throw in 3 new ideas in addition to what he said. The first is how the space, the African space, both in terms of places, regions, and cities, became complicated by nationalities that were defined as foreign. French, English, and what people also overlook, the migration of Indians and the Lebanese to some parts of Africa that led to certain complications that became big news under Idi Amin of Uganda. Crisis in Sierra Leone, but sometimes we overlook this dynamic, how in some places they became part of the project of the colonial state, either as settlers or as people looking for opportunities. And as they became part of the project, their voices are not generally recorded in literature, but they constituted a number of pressure. They serve as pressure groups in shaping many of the policies, some of which we often attribute to Europeans. The second point is how pre-colonial African nations began to adopt and readjust to circumstances that Mamadou called imperialism, or as enclave of the Atlantic. And this adjustment does vary from place to place, but some of them, they have long-term implications. One, during the 19th century, one of the biggest states in Africa, the Sokoto Empire, was created by a revolution, 1804, creating an Islamic theocracy. And years later, Shaka the Zulu also created a very formidable empire. As we enter the 20th centuries, those projects of the 19th century became extended in spite of the fact that there were imperial layers on them. They became so much extended that they influenced politics for a long time. So the Sokoto Empire, for instance, became converted into a political party in the 20th century, the Northern People's Congress. And the concept of using the 19th century to gain power in the 20th century continued. If you go back to, say, the case of South Africa, you find how Zulu nationalism of the 19th century is still so prominent today, such that it became the linchpin that brought the current president to power. So that these dynamics of the past survived this moment, but survived the colonial moment. But in that survival lie the ability of those pre-colonial nations to reconstitute identities. Identities, ethnicities are always plastic, but they reconstituted them in a way that began to adjust far more dramatically than what we find in most readings of the colonial movement that portrays them as powerless. Because the ability to redefine identity and turn it into an agency of power, that is in itself substantial power. In the case of the Yoruba that Moses has asked me to focus on, they did two things that are profound. One, which has not been written about, is a concept of indigeneity. This concept of indigeneity, you may argue, was actually foreign, in which people would say, this is my land, this is my people forever. Transhuman societies, they didn't define their engagement like that. And even if you look at the specific case of the Yoruba, there were so many movements. And during the 19th century, they fought so many wars and people moved. The town where I was born was actually established in 1829. But with the imperial power with the British, a notion of indigeneity was established, in which people began to have a sense of permanence, whether they are Igbo or Yoruba, a notion that was not there before. They began to create it and to freeze some of these notions. And in freezing them, they became part of the challenges of the politics of pluralism, the politics of ethnicity, sometimes leading to wars, and sometimes leading to divisions, and as we find in the case of Sudan, the emergence of another country in Africa. But they also began to formulate notions of modernization, something that we need a book to deal with. In formulating these notions of modernization, they began to borrow ideas from Europe, appropriating them, and they adopted the welfare discourse of the 1940s. They adopted the concept of society as manifesting a notion of progress. In other words, in the 19th century, 18th century, they were dealing with the ideology of regression, that the past was important, that you needed the past, which is tradition, to balance your society to create stability. But in the 20th century and up till now, rather than falling on the concept of regression, they fall on the concept of progress, which means that incrementally society must see change, I must see progress by counting them, number of universities, number of schools. There should be something you should be able to count. So how then do you balance regression with progress? In trying to balance this, they fell into a historical paradigm that you find becoming a meta-narrative in this part of the world, which is that the past is the best part of history. The past is the best part. The current moment is fluid, and the future is the ultimate destination. A concept of history that began to influence how narratives were constructed. But as it formulated this notion of modernization, it also triggered challenges within these various nation states, in which some were beginning to act as if they were the vanguard of this modernization. In the case of Nigeria, the Igbo and the Yoruba, because they received Western education earlier than the North, began to project themselves as the modernizers. A theoretical premise that dismissed the value and integrity of knowledge anchored to Islam, and a theoretical premise that also dismissed people that were further away from the coast. And you will find a country like Nigeria, 5 years after independence, just became torn apart, as that modernization ideology created tensions reflected in politics and policies, and very difficult to sustain. So how do you reclaim indigeneity, and how do you anchor indigeneity to a concept of modernization? In trying to do both, they needed to do two other fights. One, and two of them, we also need people to interrogate them more carefully, which is, how do you fight against the colonization of space, in which you accept change, you accept modernity, but how do you turn that ideology into your landscape, into an architecture? And how do you convert it into how you share land and how you share space? That became a fight that has not been resolved. And how do you fight, my final point, against the colonization of memory? So successfully, and this is a point that people have not credited many of these groups for, in which they are able to turn the colonial library against itself and say that we can create an alternative memory, drawing on tradition. And they began to write local history, local chronicles, amateur historians. They began to write. Not just 2 books, not just 3 books, but so many of them, that a whole genre of town histories emerged, in which you find historical knowledge, counter to the imperial knowledge, was produced as part of the process of fighting the imperial knowledge, fighting the colonization of space, and also fighting the colonization of memory. Thank you.
Yes. Both of your responses actually preempt a lot of the questions that I have on this list. So I'm going to be improvising as I go along. I'm going to be consolidating some of the questions. Mamadou, you've already touched on negritude and all of the other. There are a lot of questions here about negritude, and you touched on the colonial library. But I wanted to just follow up on something that you raised. If you could just speak to it briefly, just very briefly, in terms of the Yoruba and the movement amongst them. You've written a book titled The Yoruba Diaspora in the Atlantic World, which you co-edited with Matt Childs of the University of South Carolina, which I think provides some of the latest scholarship on the evolution of African ethnicity in the Atlantic, in the records. You also wrote Archaeology of Atlantic Africa and the African Diaspora, which also provides alternative sources for looking at the question of the Atlantic world, the evolution, the development of Atlantic cultures. I wonder if you can give us some findings from these 2 works that say something about the importance of the Yoruba influences in places like Cuba and Brazil and the Americas generally.
Thank you. My intervention on African diaspora and the Atlantic world, Black Atlantic, they've all published by Indiana University Press. They fall into, and they're also publishing 3 books of mine in the next 4 years. they fall into the following aspects. One, how do we reframe the history, which I did in a book called Atlantic History. It's not part of the one on the table. And second, how do we take just one ethnicity and look at it across the Atlantic, that's the Yoruba in the Atlantic world, and then how do we use material culture to navigate the silences, which is on the archaeology one. Then I began to do the ones on religion for them. They've published the one on the god of thunder, Shango, and they'll be doing one next year on Issue. Issue is popularized in the US by Skip Gates. It's signifying monkey. Popularized Issue in the literary world. So we return to that. And then finally, we are contracted to do a book on water goddesses in Brazil, in Dahomey, and these are all these places. So why am I interested in pulling all this together? First of all, is how do you deal with population and groups whose voices are not represented in documentation, in the written documentation? How do you deal with them? And part of the attempt to deal with that is to look for new body of evidence, written, unwritten, oral songs and proverbs, material ones. Second, what are these voices? What do they mean? So if we talk about Yemoja, the female goddess, or if we talk about Shango, what do they mean as they cross the Atlantic and as they allow older religions to be reformulated and reconceptualized, leading to very interesting arguments, two sets of arguments for people who study Brazil or Cuba, one in which people are now beginning to say that if you want to actually understand these indigenous religions, don't go back to Africa anymore. That this is where, thanks to the slave trade, thanks to the movement, they were able to sustain and preserve those indigenous religions in ways in which Christianity and Islam prevented Africans from doing so. And the second set of argument, why use Africa in terms of the pure zone rather than constructing ideas of autonomous development for many of these practices. And it's a very fascinating argument in which they say, okay, for you to understand Africa, why don't you also understand Bahia, which is also sometimes a compliment to what Mamadou said, and also his negation, in which they will say, for you to understand Bahia, you must first of all understand Africa. And some people are reversing that argument, that why don't you approach Africa from your knowledge of Bahia instead of the other way around. Then you have notions of agency, which you can flesh out in various ways. So cumulatively, we have new studies that look at people's lives and behavior and beliefs and practices over time in different spaces. And then we look at how their experiences are transformed from the onset of capitalism. The significance of this is sometimes what we call traditions in Africa. They were framed within an Atlantic world. They're framed within it, so that we may even be describing modernity, that which we call tradition. Take the example that he has mentioned, polygamy. If you were to ask me, bring the evidence that Africans have been marrying more than 2 wives, say 7th century, 8th century, say among the Yoruba, I don't have it. The first reference came with Atlantic, that we have in the record, that there have been many wives. But we frame it as traditional. And many of the institutions that we frame as traditional, the records that we have are post-15th century. in which societies began to respond and adjust to the Atlantic. The favorite food, for instance, among the Jebu of West Africa is gari. If you were to tell them that they were not eating this product before, they would say, no, you are making it up. But we know they were not eating it before because it's from Brazil. But what they said is they have traditional food, or where it comes from, the stockfish, which is from Norway. If you tell the Igbo person, I know it's not from there, that stockfish doesn't grow there, they would think they've been eating it since BC. So many of the things we frame as traditional, they reflect evidence on the onset of merchant capitalism in Africa, and how people have been trying to adjust to some of these things. And issues around change and continuity in Atlantic Africa itself. How sometimes we tend to assume that modernity is very recent. Let me give you one example. When the king of Dahomey was entertaining his guests, 17th, 18th century, they were eating French bread and drinking wine in his palace. You would think this is like, you would think this is 1960. This is not 1960. The banquets that the king of Dahomey were hosting for his visitors were European food. And they were even praising the wine they were drinking, that this is as good as the wine you will get in Paris. So many of these, the way we frame many of these issues, I think we have to revisit some of them. And the way many of these division of labor play out. But we have to give more credit to the African agency. How, as a unit of analysis, Africa is not just receiving, it's also a driving force. A driving force in a way in which its history explains many things in the diaspora, and in ways in which many developments there also frame the outcome. And one final point, we tend to take out South Africa. We tend to take out Mozambique. We tend to take out the Indian Ocean. There are currents towards that direction, but we need to integrate the Southern African to this Atlantic complex for reasons that people overlook. If you look at the products coming from Europe during this period, they contain many of those things that we call Asian products. And if you look at the traffic, you find Mozambicans, people from South Africa, even as slaves. But we tend to end this analysis in Angola, and how we are going to merge. We are not trying to merge studies of the Indian Ocean with the Atlantic. And part of what we are trying to do is to say, is there a way in which we can begin to merge some of these narratives? Let me stop here so that you can...
It is interesting because last week we had two speakers who actually who were trying to look at, to trace some of the enduring elements of African ethnicities, the Akan and the Benguelas, by starting from the New World, starting from the Americas and going back to Africa. So it's very interesting.
Just to add something on this discussion, which is actually showing the kind of complexity of the discussion about the Atlantic. Toyin was mentioning, people are saying we have to go to Bahia to understand some of the things in Africa, or the reverse, recuperating the African agency. But our former colleague Paul Johnson published a book last year which is called African Diasporic Conversions. And his main argument is, if you want to understand Yoruba religion, you go to New York. You know, New York is becoming the place where it is, this Yoruba religion are being reinvented by African American, in particular from South America, who are actually meeting Cuban and rediscovering the language of African religion in New York. We also know that more and more, with the success of Nollywood movies, Nigerians are reinventing from Nigeria kind of religious identities, you know, witchcraft, sorcery, which are taken seriously by a huge African American and Caribbean population in New York. This is also important in understanding the new waves, you know, of diasporic, intellectual, religious, and also political movement, which is changing dramatically both the understanding of Africa and the understanding of the African American world.
One second. I think I want to make a recommendation because we have powerful people here. Based on this new thinking, see, traditionally we define study abroad as packing your luggage and going to France or Senegal. I think we should also be doing study abroad within the US. Yes, and now we've reached the stage in which it is now possible to do that. For instance, you will save a lot of money trying to understand Nigeria by going to Houston. In one street alone, Bisonet, right, half of the businesses there are owned by Nigerians. In Southwest Houston, every other house you'll find in a Yoruba or Igbo person there. But these various communities within the US, they are not integrated into the school system. So we need a different kind of what I would call study abroad in America.
Yes, this conversation has acquired its own momentum. I'll try not to get in the way. It's very interesting. But let me move the discussion a little bit. I'm going to combine two questions that I have on this list for you, Mamadou. One of them has to do with the relationship that you see or don't see between colonization and the constitution or the reconstitution of the African diaspora within the Atlantic world. That's the first part. The other part is with regards to the production of knowledge about African peoples and societies through the practice of colonial anthropology and ethnography. Now, these two practices have resulted in an economy and trajectory of knowledge production that, as you would argue, sustains the very field of African studies. But also, these methods of writing about Africa and understanding Africa has also produced an Africa that is consumed primarily by African Americans or other African descended people. My question along those lines is, how does this epistemological hegemony, how does it work? And how can Africans and Africa descended people engage with it?
I think it's a great and complex question. And it's actually part of a political economy of the world in which we are living. But one thing which is important, which is new, is African intellectual history. Trying to trace ways in which Africa, you know, has a continent. Africa has an inhabited space, has been constructed. And one thing which is important to note is that the focus is much more on the Western construction of Africa, from the missionaries to the development expert. And Valente Mudimbe, in his Invention of Africa, has written probably one of the greatest books in documenting that. But missing one central point, that this was but one invention of Africa. And if we try to trace precisely these many inventions of Africa and the knowledge associated to it, we can now negotiate or try to understand how African themselves has been struggling with. So the first invention of Africa, or something which is supposedly, is Africa, is Egyptian, the ways in which Egyptian has been thinking of themselves. If you are following what is going on in Egypt today, one of the most fascinating things is nobody says that Egypt is in Africa. It's the Middle East. When, you know, it's only the Sinai. I used to tell Egyptians every time I was in Cairo, asking me, are you coming from Africa? I say, I have never left Africa, which is true. But it is an interesting thing. And you know the debate about the race of Egyptians. but you have this invention. From the Egyptian, you have an Ethiopian, which is also linked to the Bible, invention of Africa. You move, you have a Greek invention of Africa. You know, they were calling the whole continent Ethiopia, Ethiops, which is very interesting when you think about ways in which Ethiopians sometimes imagine themselves today, that they were, you know, the very definition of blackness. The Roman has their idea. They call Mauritania, the northern part of Africa, and an imagination associated to that. You have the Arab understanding, the Dar al-Sudan, the country of the black people. And you can move down. You know, you have the Europeans' invention. But one thing which has been completely missed is the African-American invention of Africa, which is key in forging even the idea of African identity. And the idea of African identity is African-American, it's not African. They invented it, what it means, and it was consolidated with the invasion of Ethiopia. So, and this is interesting, how Africa is played out in all this, and how things are moving from one moment to the other is important. But for me, you have a kind of turning point. The turning point is the end of the 19th century and the early African-American historian trying to understand the importance of Africa in defining their identity and rights in the US. The battle for civil rights in the US in the early phase was a battle about the history of Africa. Because changing the history of Africa and bringing Africa back into the universal narrative was the condition, the very condition under which African American will be able to be citizens. And Du Bois, again, is the critical person. 1915, he writes The Negro, which is a history of Africa. And he would write it 4 times until 1947, The World in Africa. And it's interesting. It's not Africa in the world, it's the world in Africa, which is that I am understanding the world from an African perspective. Du Bois is actually the first global intellectual historian. 1915, he writes a piece which is called The African Roots of the War, explaining the dynamic of the political economy of the world. So this is what is happening. The second moment, which seems to me important to understand this epistemological discussion, is the crisis of the early 20th century in Europe, in particular in France and Germany, where more and more Europeans are saying, with the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of urbanization, poverty, etc., that Europe is in crisis. And to save Europe, where do they go? They go to Africa. It's the moment which is called the moment of negrophilia. It's also the moment of cubism with Picasso. And it's not only, today we insist on painting, but a writer like Paul Morand is going to Africa and collecting epics and saying this is the only way to tell stories. Africans, they got it. Of course, this Africa is completely imagined and fabricated. It's an Africa without African, is the interesting aspect. They want to deal with Africa, but without African. But this is also the moment where actually the first ethnographers, anthropologists are beginning to write about Benin. Frobenius is publishing, Boas is becoming key. Boas is key in influencing Du Bois. Du Bois actually attended a conference by Boas. Boas was cultural relativism in Atlanta, and it's a big shift in the way in which Du Bois began thinking. It's why also Du Bois was attracted by Germany and read German. Locke also. because the German had this generation which are called the counter-enlightenment people, like Herders and Hamann, were against the French narrative of the Enlightenment, which is assuming actually one human historical trajectory. And this moment of negrophilia will help actually the early generation of the second generation of African American, but also African thinkers. Casely Hayford publishes Ethiopia Unbound to begin questioning the production of knowledge based on the Enlightenment narrative. But it's also, and it's very interesting, Du Bois will again make the point, just before dying, saying one thing which is interesting is that nobody was interested in African history or African studies. It was a political discipline. African Americans were learning and researching on Africa for political reasons. When African studies became a university field, the first people who were eliminated were African Americans, which is very interesting about how knowledge is packaged and circulated. And today is still the issue, which knowledge, who is producing it, is it authentic or not? Toyin was talking about modernization. I talk about modernity. It has a philosophical tension. Because the interesting thing is precisely the possibility or not of, inventing a vernacular modernity. But when we talk about a vernacular modernity, what are we talking about? And this is not only an African discussion. This is also interesting. I am in a department where I'm in, with people who are working in South Asia. And for these last 20 years, I have been interested by Indian historian, in particular the subaltern studies. And actually, I published the first translation of the subaltern studies in French. And one thing which fascinated me, and this is also a discussion we could take into in this space, is Indians are completely fascinated by modernization, is what we discuss, and modernity. And the idea of what one of my colleagues, Jan Prakash, called another reason. That against the Enlightenment, you have another reason, which is Indian. Against the authoritarianism of Western universalism, you had a kind of limited and pluralism Indian universalism. And you can make comparison. I have one of the former head of my department, Sheldon Pollock, published this wonderful paper where he is comparing, the quarrel of the ancient and the modern in 18th century France, and the same quarrel in England, in India, and asking himself why the modern won in Europe and they were defeated in India, which is true, they were defeated in India. So the interesting aspect for me was why are Indians so obsessed by that? The idea that they can retrieve a modernity of their own. And Partha Chatterjee has written a monograph which is called Our Modernity. And this paper is fundamental because it's saying that it's possible. The idea is not coming up with alternative modernities. The idea is to think of European modernity as one case of modernity. And if you can extract other cases of modernity in other parts of the world, you can now think about a concept of modernity which is general, looking at different cases. Africans are not asking themselves those questions. And actually, one colleague, Megan Vaughan, has written a piece against African going such a route by saying these postmodern subaltern things we are not interested. The production of knowledge by African scholar is a production of knowledge which is dealing with Ranger's concept of invention of tradition and Shannock's discussion of customary law. These are, modernity is not important. But I think that we have to address that why. And for me, the answer is probably because African has been, at least West African, has been part of the West. And many of them were Christian. So for them, the world of Christianity, and what shows it is, you know, the early African priests who did PhDs, you know, they are fascinating because they were completely obsessed by trying to salvage Christianity from slavery, saying finally, you know, the Europeans, they brought slavery and Christianity, but they brought salvation, and this is more important than so the modernity we talk, and Toyin is right sometimes, and we tend to exclude African when they have been part of the process in a dominated, subordinated position or in a marginal one. But the first group of educated West African, their problem was not to invent something. Their problem was to return themselves and their society into a narrative they were excluded from. So this has been our struggle, the struggle between a search for an authenticity which jumps over the colonial period, and people who are trying to extract an African identity from the encounter with the Europeans. Yeah. And we are still into that.
Let me, there are two questions here so that I can remind the audience. Questions around the constitution of knowledge and question around colonization and diaspora. And he has answered them, and then I will add to them by starting with the first one, issues around knowledge, by making three quick points. That at the very same time that Colonial Library was being created, using negative words about Africa, the dark continent, it was immediately challenged. It was challenged by three forces, one of which Mamadou has explained, the African-American intervention, Woodson, Du Bois. And this challenge was so effective. How come you do not hear about this challenge? You don't hear about this challenge because of the linkage between academia and power, in which the creation of what is called African history was dated to after the Second World War. And the credit in the memoir by Fage and Oliver given to SOAS in London, in which they claim it as if they invented it as a discipline, thereby disconnecting it from its organic foundation that was anti-colonial library. But there's a second strand that we have not mentioned, the trajectory that connected Ibn Khaldun to Arabic historiography, to the counter-Western narrative of the 19th century. This knowledge was so deep and profound. Whether you talk about Fodio or you talk about the Marabout, this library is so extensive. But this library has never, up until now, been grafted to Western Academy. But it's just a huge library on itself that we don't teach. And third, the confusion of sources with epistemology. So that when we talk about African oral tradition or Arabic sources, Arabic materials, we do not discuss them as epistemologies. We discuss them as sources, thereby undermining them and taking out the philosophy and the logic they represent, because they are knowledge systems on their own right. But what we've done is we've grafted them to Western conception as if they are supposed to, they are the footnotes to our own conception of knowledge, thereby undermining them. And this, they have to be rescued. How we have to rescue them is going to be a big project by itself. The second point, his former colleague, Edward Said, became famous for many things, including writing a book, Orientalism, which 20 years ago, everybody will read before you get a degree. Today, I can ask a question, where is Orientalism? Or where are the Orientalists? They don't exist anymore. The premise of Said's discussion that made him famous was that Europeans will go to Africa, and then they will insert themselves into it. Giving them credit, some will stay for years. But the Orientalists have all disappeared. Even those who do Middle East or do Africa, they just go for 2 weeks. Those are not Orientalists. Because for you to be an Orientalist, you have to do what Said said, you have to live with them. You have to do, this is an allegory of this interaction, the Orientalist and beer drinking. Your first visitation, the fly will fall into your beer. You are so horrified, you will throw away the beer. Then you go again the second time, the fly will fly into your beer. Then you will remove the fly and you will drink your beer. Then the third time, the fly will fall into your beer, the fly and the beer, you will drink it. That's the Orientalist who can drink the beer and the fly. Now, you now find even the devastation of the discipline. Jane was telling me that Vanderbilt may recruit a pre-colonialist. I didn't want to depress him, that they don't exist. They don't exist. Only a few, maybe some people train in Northwestern. I don't think I've had a student, and I've trained so many, 15 PhD students at this moment, who is doing pre-colonial Africa. Because for you to do pre-colonial Africa, you have to go there for 2 years. You have to learn the language, right? You cannot do pre-colonial Africa from London, from Public Record Office. You have to become an Orientalist. and these Orientalists, they're disappearing as quickly as you can. On the second issue of colonization and diaspora, bear in mind that slavery and colonization combined cumulatively created the formulation of what we call a Pan-Africanist project. They represented the very foundation of black radicalism. So that connection has been very deep, in which the experience of the plantation system, the European invasion after 1885, fused into a project of Pan-Africanism. Marcus Garvey, that's the platform. Du Bois, that's a platform. And one of the things, I think Du Bois, in spite of the fact that people keep mentioning him, I still keep thinking that he has not been honored enough. I think there should be a university named after him. I mean, just not even one. I think, and you may disagree on this, I will rate him as one of the most influential intellectuals of the last century. In terms of his ideas, in terms of his ability to build bridges. So a university like the University of Nigeria in Nsukka should be called Du Bois University. I mean, his stature is such that he deserves that kind of enduring legacy. The other point is, if you look at, and he mentioned this point, you cannot understand anti-colonial nationalism in Africa without understanding the civil rights movement in the US. And you cannot understand the civil rights movement in the US without understanding anti-colonial radicalism in Africa, because they fused them and they began to use the same language. They began to fall, where possible, on the ideology of socialism, and they were attacked, calling them communists. And in combining the project of colonization and slavery, the project of civil rights and anti-colonialism, you find the same threads. They were dealing with issues around race, racial domination, resistance, nationalism, deploying the same rhetorics, creating similar networks, and looking for ideologies that can sustain it. So you can't say I want to understand Malcolm X without understanding South Africa. You can't say you want to understand Martin Luther King without throwing Steve Biko. You have to connect the two faces, Kwame Nkrumah and Du Bois, in terms of the way they were articulating similar ideas, articulating similar projects, and trying to fuse. The critical question is, why did this moment just disappear? And the people I'm going to blame are Africans, in terms of how, when they created their own nation states, and when they became independent, they did not use, other than Nkrumah and Nyerere to some extent, they squandered their power. And they squandered the opportunity to maintain this network such that the kind of unity that was building up by now has become something else. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I have a question here about the place of Africa, the centrality of Africa in the making of the Atlantic world, vis-a-vis Gilroy's whole argument about whether Africa should be the center or whether we should look at the circuits and the transactions at the nodes of the Atlantic. But I'll just leave that for now. Let me go to a question that is very relevant to this moment, especially this month, as we are celebrating Black History Month, and also ties in with something you said in your last comment. It has to do with, how is Africa still the foundational reference in debates about, and I'll direct this to you first, and you respond, about Pan-Africanism, negritude, and Afrocentrism. Is Africa still, to what extent is Africa still central in that debate? And the reason I'm asking this question is that, obviously we're marking Black History Month, and we have to acknowledge that, in the face of African post-colonial dysfunction, which is something you just mentioned, and disillusionment, the squandering of the power, the post-colonial moment. In the face of all of that, it seems to me that African diasporic entities, especially African Americans, who have either emotional or programmatic investments in Africa, find it very difficult to reconcile, on the one hand, the glories of the African past, but also the miseries of contemporary Africa. They find it difficult to. So how do you?
What just you mentioned has always been part of the African-American imagination of Africa, the tension between the glories of Africa and the misery of Africa. How, as I was saying, because Africa was so important, how the issue for African-American was how to reconcile the two. And it's so clear that in 1919, when the NAACP decided, quote unquote, to send Du Bois to the Versailles Conference, it's opened a huge debate and conflict within the association. And James Weldon Johnson, who was the president, was forced to defend Du Bois and explain why he was sent. Because some of the members were saying, why are we going to be involved with decolonization or whatever in Africa? We have already our problems here. We have to deal with our problem here. We are not Africans. So the tension has always been there. But what is interesting, if you look now at Africa, the idea of Africa has vanished from Africa already. So this is one of the questions we should ask. How do we resuscitate the idea? Ngugi published last year a book which is called Africa Renaissance to recuperate the idea. And I think he had this wonderful idea saying we can understand the history of the continent has a history of division, dismembering, as he puts it. Now the idea of Africa is constituted in two halves. one which is which is diaspora, and the other which is African. The African one is completely disturbed by ethnicity, by nationality, by religious quarrels. The African American is disturbed by, you know, the idea of a nation. One of the, again, if you do intellectual history of the Atlantic, is one of the most interesting things, because you can follow really how the idea of Africa is being constructed and how to, you know, borrow Nihil Singh's title, Black is a continent, Black is a country. That the idea of Africa and the idea of an African identity were not contained in a nation, because what the nation was doing was excluding blacks. So black imagined their own nation, not nation, their own African identity has an international identity, has a diasporic and shared identity of people who are scattered. Is why Ngugi talks about remembering the dismembered body of the African identity. And this is a job which has to be done in Africa and outside of Africa, because the idea of Africa is somehow lost. Is why I was saying that finally, and if we follow what Toyin is saying, we'll find ourselves, which is 20 years ago, I think, Vansina was talking about that, saying now Africans are no longer even going to Africa. You sit in New York, in Paris, you write a book about Africa. You don't need to go there because you have mosquitoes and, you know, whatever. And I think that is going to happen, that, you know, if I want to understand Yoruba in Nigeria, I go to a corner of Queens. And it's true that I can write a book about Senegal and the Senegalese just crossing Morningside Park, just crossing it, going to the other side, because this is also another world. And I think that this is also some of the new challenges we are facing, that Africa is being reinvented outside of the continent and reinvented in a and you know, I think Obama's election is a very interesting opportunity. Paul Zeleza discusses that. It's allowed these Africans to imagine an identity of their own in the US as Americans. And this reinvention of Africa is a reinvention which is, and this is probably the most dramatic consequence, which is cutting part of the new diaspora, cutting them from Africa, but cutting them also from African Americans, and opening a space of their own. Is it positive? Is it negative? I don't know.
Okay, let me jump in a little. Trika, how much time do we have? Because I don't want to.
30 minutes.
30, for everything? We have, wow,
30,
that's...
you mean 2 minutes.
So
well, we said until 6, and
okay.
So I'm more than happy to continue this into the wee hours of the morning. My students, however,
Okay.
may have another mind.
Sure.
But so I'll let you decide.
Okay,
but
sure.
we said until 6 officially.
Sure. I'm going to just take 2 more questions from here, and we'll be done, and then we can have a few questions from the audience. But I'd like to appeal to our 2 guests to keep their responses very short, so that we are pressed for time. Just 2 more questions.
You want me to answer the one? The table?
No, I have 1 question for you.
Okay. You don't want me to answer that one? The glories one? The one.
No, let me move to this next question, because this one is specifically for you.
Okay.
You wrote about exile.
Okay.
And its anxieties, the anxieties of exile.
Okay.
You know, as a peculiar affliction that is producing a distinct diasporic sensibility among African immigrants of my generation, and of Professor Oyebade's generation. He's here as well. What, if any, parallels do you see between the anxieties and alienations of this new generation of this new diaspora, this new African and Caribbean black diasporas, and those of the descendants of slaves who were forcibly brought over to the Americas? If the similarities between the anxieties and the alienation, sense of alienation that you described.
Okay, thank you. Originally, I was supposed to give a whole lecture on this question. And as they explain it, 2 units and 2 programs were invited us, and then they realized they invited us at the same time. And it became converted into this approach. Because I opened up a new subject entirely on transnationalist Africans. Actually, that is what's of interest to me. I don't do the old diaspora anymore. I've been concentrating on what you now call the new diaspora, looking for ways to understand them as transnationalists, in ways in which I think, you may all disagree, I think when they mention diaspora and when we teach them, they're talking about the diaspora of slavery. But today, it doesn't work anymore in terms of the spectrum of this subject. I've been studying the data, and between the 1980s and now, the number that moved was actually larger than the number that moved during the transatlantic slave trade. Even in 1 year, the number that the U.S. immigration reported was larger than the number reported in the slave ship. So the number is actually far higher than what people imagine in terms of this relocation outside of Africa. So we have not been studying them. And the context is just beginning to emerge, the context of globalization, some of which Mamadou has been referring to with the New York experience. Here is the way I will simplify it. It's now possible for somebody from Ghana or Nigeria to live in the US all his entire life, just minimally interacting in terms of capitalism for income and not interacting in terms of culture. You now can eat, living in Austin, Yoruba food 3 times a day. You don't have to watch any American TV. You can watch African TV. You don't have to watch Nollywood. You can never finish watching, you don't have to watch Hollywood. You can never finish watching Nollywood. There's so many that you don't have to go to cinema anymore. You don't have to go to Foley's to buy any cloth. Any aspects of culture, they are delivered to you. And we have not studied the impact of globalizing cities, how Lagos, Dakar are connected with New York and with London, far more than you had in plantation slavery. These are part of globalizing networks that are so much integrated in ways in which the anomy that previous writers were talking about, the migration as trauma, we have to rethink some of these concepts. We have to rethink concepts of alienation. When in a year, there was a year I was in Nigeria 5 times. There's no time I will not be there. In fact, some people even think maybe I live there. So in which music and things are delivered to you. So we have, we need contrasting paradigms on forced migration, voluntary migrations, and how those play into identity. We need to look at the context of race against the background of professionals coming from Senegal or South Africa or Nigeria who see themselves as competent, with a lot of enormous cultural capital, in which a cab driver already has a degree from one university in Malawi. That's enormous cultural capital, which enables him to negotiate. We have to look at how movement of the past in slavery was constricted. You can't go back to Africa, in which the movement of the present is expanded. We have to look at how technologies of the past and the present are not the same, how the internet enables you to create nations outside of Africa, in which you now can create an Igbo nation, a Buganda nation in Europe, in ways you have to construct differently. So as we do this, we have to begin to interrogate the notion of home and homeland, in which the notion of home and homeland may be multiple. And you see this in things like marriage ceremonies. Economists will say, do not study society from what people say, but study society from what people do. Because what people do is what you can analyze. Whom do people marry? What food do they eat? Where do they go on their vacation? What clothes do they wear? And as you see what they do instead of what they say, you begin to see how cultures can migrate and how identity politics can be constructed in ways that are different from the diaspora of old. And you find that argument, to reference Obama that he referenced, was it black enough? Was how the argument began. And then the Clinton portrayed him before the South Carolina as black. And then what is his African component? And should he be claimed as African? So Obama has opened a new library of how we have to also plug the discussion around him and his rise into some of these issues. And one final point is when we talk about brain loss, we also have to be talking about brain gain. It's a dialectics. So we can see the movement of people, say from Ghana to the US, or from Gambia to Sweden. But we do not see the invisible forms of remittances, $7 billion. Now, since September 11, now we can track what you're sending them through the normal channel, the MoneyGram and Western Union. It's a staggering figure, very staggering. You cannot see migration of cultural capital. You cannot see how people sustain their kinsmen and women and friends and families at home. So it is this traffic that we don't see, how people use the resources in Europe and use the resources in the US and everywhere, and use the resources to mobilize investments at home and to also generate opportunities for people at home. So there is also substantial gain, which was not possible in the old migration systems.
All right. Final question for you, Mamadou. Last question. Is that okay? Or
You can.
keep it brief?
Yeah.
Maybe last one from here
And then last one from here, and then questions. Okay. Quickly, Mamadou, this discussion has focused mostly on the Americas to the exclusion of Europe. And I wanted to know how Africans in Europe imagine or articulate blackness as a category. And I asked this question against the background of the riots in the Paris suburbs by African immigrants, in 2005, and also the rise of the politics of racism and anti-blackness in France generally, but also in parts of Britain as well, not just in France. So the European, so if you could.
I think the French case is quite a specific case, which could be compared to the different cases. If you look at the discussion about blacks in Europe, Black Europe, one of the interesting aspects, and Trika is here, is that it's really a kind of new field, which is not only American, but it's by African Americans. And one of the first who began that, whom I know, is St. Clair Drake, who did his PhD on blacks in Britain. And if you look at what he did with what Jacqueline Brown is doing, again in Liverpool, you see quite an interesting trajectory that actually Black British discovered their blackness thanks to African American soldiers stationed in Britain. Because many of these, in particular the Nigerian who were going to Liverpool as mariners, were marrying white British and settling there, having their own circle as a group of males without associating their wife, without associating their children. The French system is different for two reasons. I went to high school in France, and for the two high school I was in, I was the only black among 2,000 people. I have never felt that I was black. Why, I don't know. I'm still asking myself. I was part of there. But I do remember people making, you know, my friends will go out, they will look at this black guy sweeping the street and will say something very derogatory. Of course, I'm not part of it. I'm kind of black French. So this idea that, and this I have seen it, and my generation, we are not a big group of people. The decision was simple. You stay in France, you marry a white girl, you become a French, that's it. Or you don't want to stay, you go home, and you marry an African woman, and you stay there. Because it was assimilating or going back. But what happened with the generation that followed my generation is for the first time in the 80s, I think, you have coming up a generation of young men and women who were able to constitute a community of their own. They no longer needed the French to, and they began making a claim my generation has never made, that they were French but different from the Français de souche. They were Muslim, they were African, they have their own rituals, and etc. And this is what is creating a problem, because the French system, which claimed to be colorblind, is unable to accept a plural understanding of citizenship. It's not only about color, but it's also about gender. It's why you don't have, you know, nobody knows how many French are Muslim, because it's illegal to count them. It's illegal. It's why when they had this discussion for these last 15 years about how to increase the number of women in the French elected bodies, and the Prime Minister Jospin proposed a quota system. The French feminist, one of them, Elisabeth Badinter, was the leader of the movement, and she's one of the greatest French feminist historians, saying, I'm against the quota. It's destroy the idea of citizenship, because citizenship doesn't have a color, doesn't have an order. You are citizen, you compete as a citizen. And it's what created what happened, because at the same time, you know, it's something I'm interested in because of the Fourth Commune. Because this, in 1974, in France, you have a kind of crystallization. The French began reinventing citizenship and their own history, saying that this is a nation which is based on republican values and citizenship, which was inherited from the French Revolution, which is absolutely untrue, actually. French citizenship has accommodated difference. The four communes are a case, but the Indian French, Pondichéry and Chandernagore, it's the same case. They were citizens, you know, maintaining, preserving their own cultural and religious value. And this is the tension that created, because the emergence of a new group of blacks and Algerians who are no longer defining themselves as migrants and no longer defining themselves in relation to their ancestors' origin, but who are claiming to be French, but a different French identity.
Okay. So I wonder if it's possible to extend a little bit for the Q&A. Okay, floor is open for questions now. Yes. Okay. Yes. If you could introduce yourself, please.
I'm Zach. I'm a professor
Okay, sure.
I see that there's like throughout history, there's a lot of examples of people who are very different initially, responding to sort of external coercion by creating a strong sort of identity of everyone who's being persecuted. You see in pre-revolutionary America, you see all these groups of different colonists who weren't necessarily similar in any way, responding to British coercion by saying, okay, well, we're American and you're not. And responding to that by calling themselves American, creating an American identity. And in World War II, you have Jews who were persecuted, who are very different sects, different countries, responding to genocide by sort of creating a Jewish identity. How do you think Africa, with respect to the colonial period, fits into this model? And if it doesn't, what do you think it says about Africans that they're hesitant to create a sort of pan-African identity?
Well, in some sense, bear in mind they also responded to imperialism and to the European powers, right? They also responded, making the argument that first they needed to decolonize, by which they meant Europeans should leave, and second, the countries created for them, Nigeria, Gambia, Senegal, that they wanted to convert them to nations, onto nation states, which has been very difficult. The 19th century, Italy, Germany, they struggled to bring together those autonomous nations. So if you study Bismarck, Garibaldi, you are looking at how they said these autonomous states, they will convert into nations. So Europeans from the onset displaced the notion of the state with a different intellectual trajectory from how African nations were created, and say, okay, we're giving you what they call states first. We're giving you Nigeria and Gambia. So they reversed the process. So the struggle is how then they move from nation to state. How then will African move from states to nation? It's been very difficult. It has never been an easy project, because you are defining citizenship, you are defining identity, and you are dealing with various forms of nationalism, of religion, of gender, of ethnicity, so that you are dealing with centripetal and centrifugal forces at the same time, which will tear you apart and bring you together. And then you have the complication of a country like Rwanda. How do you manage a dual society, Hutu and Tutsi? How do you say, let's go and vote? And then you're also dealing with the complications in the last set of questions of mobile diasporas, mobile citizenship. People like me, where do I come from? In which, when you throw in, say, my children, I can complicate the argument for you. Because the grammar of their own existence is different from my own grammar. Very completely different, in which can we impose the paradigm of, say, Africa on my children? It's not going to work. Can we impose the paradigm of African American on them? It's not going to work. Can we impose the paradigm of whiteness on them? It's not going to work. So you also have this fluidity. So identitarian politics, that's jargon. The politics of identity is plastic, it's a process, it keeps changing, and it's also situational.
Yeah, and just to add one thing, it's an important question, but Africa faced different options, actually, and the option of having a unitarian Africa was defeated. In West Africa, Senghor kept pushing and even decided that he was ready to accept a kind of Franco-African federation to preserve the Federation of West Africa. And he was defeated, as Toyin said. And this is today the problem. This is still a discussion, how to recreate nation, but nations which are going outside boundaries which are the product of Europe. And as Toyin was saying, it's complicated by the fact that also Africans outside Africa are playing a key role. And it's where sometimes when new electronic instruments are interesting. I am just talking with my kids. I discovered the importance of Facebook in their relationship. I don't know, but sometimes they show up and tell me about their cousin who is in Dakar, about his problems, what to do, which I didn't know, even that they knew them. So Facebook is also opening a completely different world to these kids inside Africa and outside of Africa. So this is opening new possibilities of, and I see it at Colombia, the fact that you have all these young Africans coming from different backgrounds, sticking together from Uganda. My daughter went in December for her vacation in Uganda. So, and this is, I think, something which is completely also new, how new networks are being built by this new generation, some of them working at Wall Street, etc., which is reopening also the boundaries, the state boundaries of these African nations.
Everyone, my name is Yolande, and the question I have for most people on the panel is talk about that Nigerians are just Africans in the diaspora, and how a lot of them live in these global cities but have little interaction with outsiders. Like as you said, you were from New York. I'm from New York too, and my mom sells on Broadway. Like she sells makeup, and it's mostly like West Africans, and like most people don't even speak much English. So, do you think that it's negative that they don't really interact into the system, and what effects do you think that has on their children?
I think that is probably one of the greatest change. The Africans are now, they live in Harlem. And I know people who have been living in Harlem for these last 40 years. They have never talked to an African American. Because they are migrants. They will not learn English because they think that they are not making money learning it. But they will invest the money they are making to make sure that their kids are going to school. 60% of black students at Columbia are African. They are African, and they are the majority in the Ivy League, African kids. And African kids which are daughters and sons of migrants, illiterate migrants. So this is the difference. This is a choice which is made. I lived in Ann Arbor, and I used to go to Detroit, and I was fascinated by one thing. The Board of Education of Detroit was 90% Nigerian, PhDs. And they were investing in this board of a rundown city because they wanted good school for their kids. And they kept fighting. So this is the distinction. They don't want to assimilate in the American society. This is clear. But they want their kids to assimilate and become American. And for them, it's why they behave like Chinese migrants. They invest on education, they work hard, and they believe that they have to sacrifice for their kids. For Francophones, it's the same thing. But Francophones are trying to salvage the two, the language. You make choices. Some of them, among the Senegalese, they will make one choice. They will speak Wolof to their kids and let them learn English. Others are trying, and this is one of the battles in Harlem, to create charter school in which you have space to learn French. So, but these are difficult choices, which are sometimes influenced by a kind of long-term project. Are you, and this is an important thing, are you planning to go back? And are you understanding what your kids are? Every time I go to Dakar, when I have a discussion, it's the same thing. When I say, what are your kids going to do? I say, I don't know. Are they coming back? I say, no. And even if they come back, they go back with what I call the missionary mentality of the Americans. They are going to fix the Africans. They are going to solve their problems because they don't understand. And when they think like that, it's better for them to stay here.
Well, I thought you say your name is Yewande, right? So how come, that's a Yoruba name, right? So your mom is Zimbabwe, your dad is
My
Yoruba.
dad is Yoruba too.
So you're a complex, you have a complex identity. Well, there are two quick answers to the question. One that I would call the concept of cultural capital, and the other one, the concept of migrant incorporation. Some people will say incorporationism to turn it into a jargon. That's why they give us big salary. Now the first one is what Mahmoud is talking about, these parents being able to send their children to Ivy League, which created a lot of tension some time ago when Henry Gate and I don't know the batteries. Okay. I don't know everything. Eats food. I think I'm going to eat food. Now, in which he said that we have to change the way we count these students, these black students. I don't know how many of you follow this debate, saying that what schools like mine and yours are counting as black has to be recalibrated, that they should be counting the children whose grandparents are African Americans. Because you find universities count them as black, but the children from Ghana or children of oil workers from Shell in Nigeria or his kids, my kid, and it's creating his own dynamics. But the very success that creates that dynamic, I use a concept of cultural capital, in which these people bring a set of skill, and they run a budget of what you call a focus, in which they will say, this is what, I am not successful, but I want my 3 kids to become successful. Now, I as an historian, the problem is even convincing the kids of your parents and some of these people to do history. So when we set up Yoruba program, say in my school, it can only survive by recruiting white students. Because the first person who will say, what are you doing in that class, is an African parent. I did not send you to school to go and read English. I sent you to school to go and read engineering and medicine. What do you want to do with a BA in history? Do you want poverty to be reproduced in my family? So they're very assertive in doing that. And then the politics of incorporationism, the argument by host societies is always to assume that migrants want to assimilate and they want to incorporate, not understanding that migrants also play the politics of being an outsider, in which outsidedness is a source of power. And that which you call segregation is also a source of power. That has not been written upon. Because what fascinates people is how do they incorporate, but not how they refuse incorporation as a strategy of survival. And I think it's a good point.
Tiffany?
I was only going to respond to this question of numbers and the creation of these insular migrant communities. This is not new for migrants in general. The Chinese, for example, created insular communities before the advent of technology. Nine Shaw's work shows on California that they knew more about what was going on in China than they did what was going on in the United States. They read Chinese language newspapers. They didn't speak English, and this would last for 2 or 3 generations. I think the question is, what has changed, and when did the numbers increase from African migrants? This is a post-civil rights phenomenon, and it's a moment in which the walls of segregation came down. And I think that in analyzing what is happening socially, we have to keep in mind the political
dynamics,
and dynamics that have taken place in this post-civil rights movement. The Africans who came behind the walls of segregation tended to interact with black communities because they also came for an education, and most of them went to black colleges. And I'm thinking of Nkrumah, Nzikwe,
Banda,
even Malani,
yeah.
who came a decade or so later and would go back to Mozambique. They went to, Malani went to Syracuse, but he goes back to Mozambique. And of course, we know the history of Nkrumah and Nzikwe. The post-civil rights group is coming where a number of things are shifting, and I think this answers the question not only of how they're reacting to the larger African-American community and the larger white community, we also need to look at these shifting politics and explaining why certain knowledges have disappeared from universities. I was a graduate student in the 70s and 80s, and all of those writers that you were mentioning, of course, we had to cut our teeth on, and then all of a sudden they were gone. We read Frantz Fanon, we read Said, we read Fage and Oliver, and so on at that time, and all of a sudden it's gone. And I think there are political answers to these. There's an answer there that has to do with politics as to why it's been a certain shifting in that kind of knowledge, and now you have whole generations, irrespective of race. In my classes here at Vanderbilt, whether they're white, black, or African, I can run a list of names that they've never heard of that were commonplace just 2 generations ago. So I think that it's not so much I've heard that argument about the large numbers of Africans coming now, but the question to me, it seems, is why? Because they didn't come before. For example, in Minneapolis, where I went to graduate school, that's one of the largest Somali communities in the United States. When I was in graduate school, there were hardly any Somalis in the United States. So we need to ask what created that change from Italy to the United States. So I want to just throw that out as to be considered as we ponder these questions.
Two issues. The second one is structural adjustment of the 1980s, in which policies taken by the IMF, World Bank, triggered economic changes. Currencies were devalued, people lost their jobs, so that adjusting to economic circumstances in many parts of Africa required options of migration. What people have not actually also studied is that migration within Africa is actually far more intense than migration outside of Africa. When Boutros Ghali left his job, he set up an Afro-Arab summit, of which he put me as a member, in which we began to track migration within Africa itself and formulate laws to protect people, especially people stranded in places like Morocco, trying to go to Europe. That number is tied to changing economies. As to your question of changing context, absolutely correct, such that even you can criticize the current generation of African migrants, not sensitive to, right, the very process, part of the politics of civil rights that made it possible for them to come here. So the criticism of African Americans is misplaced, because according to them, they can see opportunities that they cannot see, but not fully recognizing the fact that society has changed. But in society changing, that which you observe in your class, I will connect it to 2, and there's no time here, to 2 other ideas. One, I will call it the politics of seduction, and the other one, the politics of popular culture. Say, my generation, your generation, we could talk about violence, like your Frantz Fanon. I was into some politics, member of underground movements and things like that, anti-military. We could incorporate the language, rhetorics, and practices of violence. This current generation does not. And you can see part of the rise of Obama was to just not move near any reference to violence or move near any reference to the angry black man. He just packaged himself. You would think that even in private, he wouldn't even get angry. But that becomes part of the politics of avoiding a previous generation. And politics of seduction, iPod, like the ice cream of my generation, the Facebook, they all have political consequences. They all have enormous political consequences. When I was in the university, the purpose was not tied just to career, it was tied to politics, right? If you were to ask a student now, why are you in school, right? It's tied to consumption, not to constituency building, not to community building. So that the BMW, black man's worry, right? The car, becomes the meta-narrative of life, not changing society as the meta-narrative of diplomacy. So many of these things have changed in profound ways.
Yeah, I agree with what you say, but the situation, many of the issues are tied to the fact also that the migration has changed. If you look at the early generation, they were coming to study. They were coming in the US to study. And in many cases, they joined the African American. They went to African American college. If you see, and it's true, with this large move, which are the consequences of structural adjustment, but also of the tightening of migration policies in Europe, the Senegalese were not coming to the US until the 80s. And today people are saying you have probably between 150 and 200,000 Senegalese. So coming here is and these people are, and this is the other problem, they are joining their communities. They no longer need the type of support the early generation, the early generation needed. And they are more and more able to find their way. And the third issue, which seems to be more important, is you know, and it's twofold. One is that precisely among African and African American, the discourse of Pan-Africanism is dead. And even, you know, I am at Columbia, I know my African American colleague. We don't sit together to do something together. I think this is the difference with the Chinese. The Chinese were joining Chinatown. They were reinventing Chinatown. We don't do that. Why don't we do that is, for me, an important question. Why are we not trying to raise such a question and address it is also an important thing. The other aspect, which is also something we need to discuss, is that, you know, for Africans, these new migrants, they come to the US, they see that the marginalized, oppressed is the African American. And they are telling themselves, like, you know, black Latins, we are not going there. Because if we go there, we are going to lose. We are going to be American Africans, not African American. We have to sit down and address it. And what does it mean? And this is today issues which are important, but we cannot, because we keep fighting, all of us, to keep African studies there, African American studies there. Because reopening the discussion will have consequences on the field we are claiming. It will have also political consequences. I tried to organize 3 years. When I arrived in Harlem, I discovered that I was caught into these two pressure groups. The Africans, the Senegalese, they have seen with my name, which is a crazy Senegalese name. It was obvious, so they wanted something, a piece of Colombia. With African American, I was a historian. I used to go to the Schomburg. And I decided that I was going to, because these migrants were Muslim, I was going to organize a huge conference on Islam with an art exhibit on Sufi Islam. And I found the money, I gave it to the Schomburg to organize it, to make sure that I can bring African and African American. And I failed miserably. It didn't work. I brought the only Senegalese internationally known Sufi singer. I did everything. It didn't work because you have these two communities, they don't want to talk to each other. So what do I do in the middle? How do, and Toyin is true. We saw it in Michigan. Every year in Michigan, we had a crisis with young blacks because they were saying, we don't want to be taught African American or African studies by a person who doesn't look like us. But when you tell them, what are you going to do? You know, lawyer, engineer, etc. So, and the idea, and it's happening, I have seen in 10 years down the road at the University of Michigan, everybody who will be teaching African American studies will be white. Because you don't have nobody. So these are problems which are really important, but we are not raising them as a group.
Okay, I'm going to, Trika is not going to be happy with me about this, but I'm ready to take the hit. I'm going to use my dictatorial powers as the moderator to ask a question that is dear to my heart, that I think some of the undergraduates here would benefit from. Now, there is this whole thing about slave trade tourism going on in West Africa, West Central Africa. We saw it on TV. Obama and his family went there. When I teach about the slave trade, I like to show that picture. And there's also a debate. Professor Falola, I followed the debate on the BBC, and you were one of the most prominent commentators in that debate. And you took a position. I don't know how many of you know that the Jackson family are planning to build a resort in Badagry on the site of the slave trade, the slave market in Badagry. They were trying to build a resort, a 5-star resort with all kinds of luxury, you know, and there's a huge debate. Sorry?
The Jackson.
The Jackson family.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Jackson family.
Yeah.
So please, I want these two prominent Africanists to speak to this issue. Is there a formula? Is there a formula for achieving a healthy balance of respectable memorialization regarding the slave trade and responsible commercialization? Is there a formula to achieve a balance between the two?
Okay. Well, money and memory. Money and memory will clash, and part of my answer will also extend some of what he's saying, in which you have African Americans, looking at these sites in a very different way. I do not know whether you follow the African burial sites argument in New York, but that argument was preceded by various other ones in which people have made a consistent argument that when a site belongs to them, you can't trample on it. You cannot reconstruct the history for them. They have the rights to the site, and the site is connects to their own memory. Call it is an interior perspectives in which, on the African side, when they take race argument out of these sites, the interior arguments that they make in this part of the world begins to change a little bit. And second, when they throw in issues around poverty into it, they begin to say, is there no way to make money from this site? And also bear in mind the emotional issue. What does slavery represent? What does it what represents? It's very shocking that, and people may not know this, that collecting traditions on the oral traditions on the transatlantic slave trade in many parts of Africa is almost an impossibility. Because that body of tradition, not the domestic one, the transatlantic, does not actually exist. So that the way the memory of slavery has been done is quite different from how history and memory can be connected in this part of the world and disconnected in Africa. And how, finally, when, especially in the 80s, when some of these arguments began, how they were looking for how to connect tourism to new economies, in which they're saying, can people begin to come to Ghana or come to Nigeria, driven by the need to look at sites, driven by how you can benefit from this memory. So how is this going to be reconciled? I think the global forces of capitalism will keep driving some of this agenda, and the global forces of memory will begin to do some kind of reconciliation. There have even been suggestions by some African Americans that why can't they buy some of these sites and turn them into sacred sites so that it will be less commercialized. But in places where they're looking for money, I think the power of money may override the power of memory.
Mamadou, briefly, because it's also an issue in Senegal.
Yeah, but because in Senegal it has never been a problem. You have this site which, because one of the things we have to also keep in mind, sometimes it shocks people when I say that, this site of memory were invented by the white people, not by us. How do we take them over becomes one of the most important aspects. And how do you reconcile these things? I don't have a problem of having that, as long as it's about reinventing these sites, making them available and using them as tool of education. One of the most important, I think, possibilities of African American or whoever investing in this site is to bring back in Africa the missing piece. Because the Africans, they don't know what has happened in the oversight. And they don't have a clue. And sometimes, you know, Gore is visited by 100,000 of African American and white people. Senegalese are not going there. They don't know. They even don't understand what is it about. So how do you rebuild those sites? How do you make them meaningful for even the people who are claiming it's more? For me, it's more important than anything else. If people are able, because this is, in South Africa, it has changed. The idea of heritage in South Africa is precisely the idea of using memory and capitalism to make things available to people. So I don't think that the discussion is about saying, no, we don't do it because it's about money. The problem is, how do you make sure that, yes, you can help people make money and do something meaningful?
There's one thing about that. My students read in the slave trade course about a debate that emerged, I'm not sure if it was Goree Island or Cape Coast in Ghana, where some, though, wanted really to make it such a resort that you erased the memory, because there was a whole debate about the slave castles, the places where slaves were housed. And if you go in there, of course, you still see the markings and the stench and so on, and they wanted to whitewash that. And so I have a few articles where this is a part of the debate. So I think the only caution becomes, if you reconcile that, do you end up with the money erasing the memory and lending itself toward the resort end rather than the educational end?
In many cases, it's impossible, because if you look at the slave castle of Goree, they were houses.
Yes.
They were restored back. And it's what happened also in many cases in Ghana. And I think that the debate, the states will never allow that. And the people also within, in particular the elite, will never allow that. The discussion is about is it possible to make money from that or not? It's much more for debate than anything else.
Well, we apologize for going over. We really do. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Yes,
is that right?
Indeed, I just have one.
Oh, sure.
I'd like to also thank John Brasso in the back, who can't hear us because he has his earphones on, maybe he does, for setting this up. This will be also streamed and available to review again, my students in particular, and so please take advantage of it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.